Hello, and welcome to the Brook and Rail's Common Ground. I'm Anya, an events assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of being your MC today for a conversation with Alyson Baker, Danielle Belasco, Gabriela Salazar, and Rail ArtTonic editor Jessica Holmes, as well as Olga Dekalo, on the collaboration between the Held Foundation and the River Valley Arts Collective. Gabriela will be joining the conversation at around 2 p.m., just in time for the Q&A portion. And to close, I will be reading from Rail poetry editor Anselm Berrigan's new book, Pregress. At the Rail, we open all of our events with two very important acknowledgements. The first is that here in New York, we are on Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second is an acknowledgement that Black lives matter. The heart of both of these acknowledgements is a commitment to the liberation of the oppressed and solidarity for all who struggle for freedom, in recognition that when it comes to liberation, our histories never unfold in isolation, as said by the great Angela Davis. In that spirit, I encourage you all to check out the chat for a living document of resources and actions. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Before establishing River Valley Arts Collective in 2018, Alyson Baker was the executive director of the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum. Alyson has previously served as executive director of Socrates Sculpture Park, was director of Hearn Gallery, and associate director of Gagosian Gallery, curatorial assistant in the contemporary art department at the Carnegie Museum of Art. Art historian Daniel Belasco is executive director of the Held Foundation. He previously served as Henry J. Lear Associate Curator of the Jewish Museum and Curator of Exhibitions and Programs at the Samuel Dorsey Museum of Art at SUNY Newport. He holds a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. Curator and educator Olga Dekalo is based in Germantown, New York. Formerly, she was associate curator at the University Art Museum at University at Albany. From 2016 to 2018, she was assistant curator at the Katona Museum of Art in Westchester, New York. From 2013 to 2016, she was curatorial associate at the not-for-profit Alternative Space Participant, Inc. Artist Gabriela Salazar examines the relationship of the built environment and material histories to our sense of self and place. She has had solo exhibitions at Nurture Art and the Bronx River Art Center, among many others. Salazar currently has a solo show curated by Olga Dekalo with River Valley Arts Collective at the Held Foundation in Boyceville, New York, and more on that very soon. And New York area-based writer, editor, and critic Jessica Holmes has been rooted in the art world for the past 20 years. From 1999 to 2018, she worked for the Calder Foundation, including 6 years serving as its deputy director. Jessica is the editor of the ArtTonic column at the Rail. She holds an MFA in art criticism and writing from SBA. And without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you, Anya, and thank you to our wonderful panel for being here today, and to all of you who are joining in the audience. To begin, I thought that before we go through the sort of virtual tour of the exhibitions on view, we'd talk a little bit about the Held Foundation as well as River Valley Arts Collective, the backgrounding and subsequent and recent collaboration. Daniel, would you like to speak a bit about the Held Foundation?
Oh, Daniel, I think you're muted.
Yep, I got it.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'll start over. Thank you, Jess, Anya, the whole Rail team. It's really a pleasure and honor to be able to participate in the conversation this afternoon. I've been watching them over the last 18 months or so, and I've really relied on these as a great source of connection and information sharing. And, in these very, originally isolated, but now still confusing and challenging times. So I really appreciate all the work that everyone has has been doing on a daily basis. So I just want to give a couple of brief introductory remarks to Al Held and the Al Held Foundation. The emphasis really of this panel should be about the contemporary artists and the exhibitions that we have on view. But they are, happening under the auspices of the Al Held Foundation. Al Held was a major American abstract painter, best known as an originator of hard edge abstraction in the early 1960s. He was a New York-based artist, and he also was a pioneer of postmodernist painting with his black and white period starting from 1967 through the late 1970s. He was also an important educator, taught at Yale through most of the 1960s and the 1970s, and really has an enormous legacy of both contemporary work in his own time, but also ongoing influence, part of which has been established through his own foundation, which was formalized and registered as a 501c3 nonprofit by Held in his lifetime in 1990. It was pretty much dormant until his death, his somewhat unexpected death in 2005, when the foundation kind of took over the remainder of his collection, the property, the art assets. And we now have the dual mission, like many artist endowed foundations have, which is on the one hand to continue to further and promote the legacy of Al Held through exhibitions, publications, all sorts of institutional collaborations, and as well as also have a much larger sort of educational mission in supporting contemporary art and art education. I joined the foundation as director in 2016, and one step into these extraordinary barns, which Held purchased in 1965. It was an old dairy farm, which he turned into his studios. Anyway, one step into these barns, as a curator, I knew they had to be filled with art. They were extraordinarily inspiring spaces, both originally for Held. When he purchased them, he considered them his cathedrals, in which he could really make his most ambitious, most inspirational work. But I knew that there would be other opportunities somehow to bring new artists in and to bring in new artists, new artworks. I wasn't exactly sure how we would do it because we were very quiet and very private. We're in a rural residential area. So that's, I think, where I will segue into Alyson, because the partnership that we've had with River Valley for the last year plus, really almost the duration of the pandemic, somewhat ironically, has really been the key for the foundation to open up our spaces to contemporary artists and also the larger community of people who are interested in seeing their work. So I think I will now pass the mic, so to speak, over to, there's another view of the property today, the different barns that we'll be talking about. So anyway, Alyson, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Daniel, and also thank you to the Rail. It's been incredible having this opportunity to speak to everyone, and I really appreciate it and appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit more about what we've been doing with River Valley Arts Collective. We founded River Valley Arts Collective about 2 years ago now. It came after a full year of Candace Mady, my partner in all of this, and myself traveling around the Hudson Valley, visiting our colleagues and a lot of artists, artist residency programs, and assessing and understanding, or beginning to understand, the cultural landscape of the region. When we talk about the region, we're talking about a very large geographical area, basically from Kinderhook and Ghent to the north, Beacon, Newburgh to the south, and from the Catskills to the Berkshires. And so it's a huge community, it's a diverse community, in some cases isolated siloed. And a big part of what we were hearing from the artists we were meeting with was that they had gained so much from moving into or deciding to stay in the region, but also missed opportunities that they may have had in graduate school or in studio buildings or in urban centers, particularly New York. When I was living in the city, I was inspired by and learned a lot through my time at Socrates Sculpture Park. And whether it was a predisposition to moving into a more natural environment, many of the artists that I worked with while I was there ended up relocating to the Hudson Valley. And so it was a migration I had been aware of and been really interested in, and was eager to understand what it meant to be a part of a contemporary art dialogue from a rural setting. One of the things we responded to the most in speaking to all of the artists that we met during that year of research and continuing to do now is that they enjoyed and appreciated the opportunity to work in their own studios, in larger spaces, in a quieter environment, in one that was more connected to nature, but that they did miss the interactions and the inspiration and energy that they got from seeing and being around other artists. And then combined with that, again, lessons learned at Socrates about artists working side by side and the notion of skill sharing and a non-hierarchical learning environment that happened in the open studio at Socrates. I wanted to offer both of these possibilities as part of the mission for River Valley Arts Collective. So long background, but basically the mission is to support and essentially connect the artists who are living in our region. And we're doing this through exhibitions and workshops. At this point, we originally thought that we would have a permanent singular location, but COVID confirmed something that we had already started to sense, which is that by partnering with other organizations, not having a singular permanent location and instead essentially alighting in different areas of our region to present our programming, we're actually able to reach so many more people and in their own environment. And so what you're seeing now on the screen is an image from a workshop that we did at the Held Foundation last year in October. It's a natural dye workshop. It started with a foraging walk through the environment around the foundation and came back and we were creating, oh, I'm sorry, this is actually, this is the basket making workshop. We have a dye making workshop coming up. So this is the same story though, foraging first, coming back and making things from things that are gathered in the environment. And that I think speaks to one of the undercurrents of our mission, which is one is to connect artists to the natural environment and help people understand the possibility of sourcing materials there. So rather than entering into the commercial art supply opportunities, instead understand the environment immediately around you and what can be sourced there. And because that was going to be part of our discussion, we decided very early on to focus on three materials: fiber, wood, and clay, all three readily, naturally available in the environment. And so the workshops have focused on ways to make those materials accessible to artists living in the area. But our exhibitions also focus on those. And Olga will speak to that a little bit later and her approach to working with an artist who she knew was familiar with those materials, but also what we've always tried to do with our exhibitions, which is surprise our viewers. So we know that people will have preconceived notions of what those materials are and what they can do and how they are used, especially since it crosses over a lot with craft, and we are talking about craft practices within our workshops. So to be able to surprise people and have exhibitions and present work that's using those materials, but in ways that are maybe not so expected. So just a summary, our focus being on fiber, wood, and clay, our primary programming being exhibitions and workshops, our mode of operation being partnerships. We were thrilled to meet with Daniel and Mara and Lily and the team at the foundation and to be able to last year present the work of Laura Kaufman in the Bull Barn, the upper part of the Bull Barn, which you're actually seeing on the right side of the screen right now. And we have expanded that programming this year, and Olga Dekalo joined Candace and myself to curate the exhibition that's there now. And then I curated and was really pleased to get back to presenting outdoor sculpture, the on the grounds component. So I am not so sure how long I've been rambling on, but should I hand it to Daniel again, or?
Sure. And if you'd like, we can move over to some of the images of the On the Grounds exhibition that is currently up at the foundation. And I mean, I think it exemplifies so much of what you were just saying, Alyson, especially when you're talking about the materials that you're focused on. Because, in itself, I think a really unique aspect of the River Valley Arts Collective to really think deeply about certain materials.
Sure, I'd be happy. That would be great if we could move on to the images of Joy, Pam, and Christina's work. I'll talk a little bit about the exhibition that's there now of these three pieces, kind of how they came to be. In each case, well, I should actually start with the invitation. When the foundation invited us to present work outdoors, we approached it very much the same way we had when we were conceiving of exhibitions for within the space, which is that we are operating in a space that's been completely designed and built by an artist and was used by that artist as an environment for the creation of his own work. And so one of the things that I thought was pretty fascinating and wonderful was that when the foundation invited us to come and curate exhibitions for the grounds and for the inside, there was never a mandate to specifically select artists that were operating in some way, specifically in the tradition of Al Held. Instead, I think we all understood that any artist that was coming in was going to absorb and respond to that environment and would find their own inspiration directly from his work, but certainly also from the environment that he created. So what we're seeing here now is the work of Pam Linds. Pam and I worked together at Socrates Sculpture Park, and I had been keeping track of her work for all of the years in between and had seen a project that she had done during the sort of truly quarantine period of the early months of COVID, when she and other people began using a glacial erratic, a large rock that was placed onto Montrose Street in Brooklyn during a construction period. And it became a sort of de facto gallery space or platform or pedestal for the presentation of objects. And she documented this in an Instagram account, and I'd seen that. And so when I began to think about this site with these large natural rocks all around the pool, I connected it to that, combined with the fact that Pam had done an installation of smaller ceramic pieces installed in a circle. And I was really responding to, and I thought she would too, the hard edge of the swimming pool that had been there. You might remember in the original image of the foundation, the aerial image, which is much older, this was in fact an actual swimming pool and was Al Held's swimming pool. He was an avid swimmer. He had a pool here in Boyceville and also at his home in Italy. And after his death, the foundation allowed the pool to what I have become called feral. So we call it a feral swimming pool now. And it has turtles and fish and frogs living in it and is much more of a pond. But because it retained that hard edge of the original swimming pool, there was a framework for Pam to work with. So I think we can keep scrolling through. I think there are some more images along the way. She did a piece called Puddles and Wedges. It's an extension of a work that she began in 2016 of ceramic eyes with tears coming from them. And she talks about the puddles as the counterpart to that series, which was emotive and releasing. And these are instead holding and embracing. And so the puddles were crafted from clay and made to hold water. And when she began conceiving of the installation and knowing these more or less flat objects were going to be going onto irregularly formed stones, she developed the wedges as well. And they had a utilitarian purpose, which was to level out the puddles so that they could hold water, but they also became the color wheel that sort of unites all of the pieces around the pond. So the sequence of the colors of the wedges goes from sort of blues to oranges and greens, and as you move around, and it helps connect them all. As you approach the piece, you see one immediately, and then understand that it is a surrounding. I think we have a few more if you want to continue to move through. Oh, now we're on to Christina's piece. That's good. So it's a good connection. A little further up the hill, Christina Tanaglia created this sculptural installation. It's a good image where we're looking now because you can begin to see that it is the form of a rectangle that's actually cantilevered out over the edge of the hill. And it's deploying a lot of materials and methodologies that have been in her work for some time. I first knew about her work when we were, Candace and I co-curated an exhibition at the Carnegie Museum, and she was a part of it. And so I got to know the work well through that, and knew that she was working with these slabs of wood and with ceramics, a great combination in really unusual ways. And so we invited her to participate, and what was great, and I think this is a really good example of when you talk about a mission that's to support artists in their work and to commission new work and create connections. Through the Held Foundation, Daniel introduced us to Hart Perry, who owns an estate, an 80-acre estate right on the Hudson River in Germantown called Southwood. And he has his own mill on the site. And as these old growth oak trees are coming down, he's milling them. And through the introduction via Daniel, we were able to bring Christina to the site, and Hart generously offered her the wood that she needed to make this project. So she got all of the live edge slabs of oak from out of a barn. They'd been seasoning for a couple of years and were ready for use, and was able to put them to use in expanding the scale of her work. So in many ways, this opportunity became an opportunity to grow aspects of her work that she'd been experimenting with. This was only the second time she'd ever worked outdoors. It's certainly by far the largest scale work she's done, and take a few chances in terms of using materials that otherwise would have been really expensive for her to acquire, but she was able to use them, and use them generously for this installation. There's a lot to say about this work, and Christina does a wonderful opportunity during the tours. So maybe this is a moment to pitch to come on October 10th if you can. She'll be there to talk about the piece. But I think another little piece of the story in terms of the bigger picture here is that the foundation offers a rather unusual opportunity to create outdoor works in a relatively secure environment. And many of the things that I would have had to troubleshoot around while I was at Socrates, a public park, completely open, unattended, all year round, we could take a few more chances in terms of material use and the ways in which we were doing the installation here, because the encounters would happen during tours and would be more monitored. But we were also thinking about chances in terms of how these materials were going to work together. And when you have raw wood and you have ceramics affixed to it, there are these opportunities for the wood to swell or warp and actually break the ceramics. So there were these experiments that were happening in terms of just how far that could be pushed. She was also working, or is working, with low-fired clay. So the clay was absorbing water. The minerals within the clay are oxidizing. So the colors of the clay are changing along with the wood is changing. So much to say about this, but we should keep moving along in our tour. If we could go to the next slide. This is Joy Curtis's work. Joy is also an artist that I worked with both at Socrates and at my time at the Aldrich. Again, had followed her work with great interest as she had transitioned to working with textiles. The pieces that I had seen were similar in shape to this work, that had this sort of sense of a rib cage and this sort of meat and visceral kind of feeling to it, also animal feel. And so I think we have another picture after this that might show, yes, great, thank you, more of the piece. So Joy was able to take a lot of what she had been working with in the pieces that she had created for gallery installations and expand the scope and size, just as Christina had been able to do. And in part, we did this through another partnership, in this case with Stoneleaf Retreat, which is a artist residency program, which is nearby. And Joy had a couple of weeks there to develop the work, understand scale within nature, so that she was able to actually, while she was working on it, take it out into the woods and see what it would look like. And it was immensely helpful in being able to understand how to make that transition from a gallery indoor space to an outdoor space, and how scale would be affected. It also did an interesting thing in allowing it to collaborate with the trees around it as its support structure. So rather than relying on hanging on a wall and essentially being a relief, it became a sculpture in the round, allowed the trees to hold it up. It's connected by cables to the trees, and also react to the wind. It has a lot of movement to it when the wind comes up that big hill, and it sort of animates all of the inspiration that came to make Joy fall upon this form. So it moves, it's animal-like, it's almost prehistoric, it may be very mythical, and it's somewhat aquatic too when the really wind catches it and it starts moving around. And because the piece is really about this creation myths and myths about the connection between earth and sky, there's the celestial disc at the top of it, this creature connecting the two, and this setting. If you were there, I always turn people around at this moment and have them look at this amazing view down the hill towards the barns with the Catskills in the background. Is just an incredible moment of thank you, perfect. A perfect moment to understand her inspiration, the mythologies that she's been looking at, and the relationship to nature that this has. And like Christina's piece, it too has changed over time. The dyes, the natural dyes that she's used have changed color, and it has bleached out a bit. So it has emphasized that relationship to a skeleton or bones that are left out in nature to bleach and become less dark and meaty, and instead white and bare and bone-like. Really amazing transformation to have seen during the course of the summer. So I think that might be the last slide. Let's see what the next one is. Perfect, yes. So this is a great time. Now we can hand it over to Olga and talk a little bit about the installation indoors. And I know Olga had asked to start with the final slide, so that's why we're slipping down to number 33. So Jess, do you want to hand it to Olga?
Yes, thank you, Alyson.
Great, good, thank you.
So we'll go back in history a little bit here. I also want to give a big thanks to the Rail, the whole team, and really I'm so happy to be part of this panel and talk about Gabriela's work. Gabriela will join us at the end of the session at right around 2. And I love how, Daniel, you framed this as this sort of digital tour, which it's all the pictures are doing the grounds and the space justice, and it'll be a little bit more tricky seeing the indoor installation shots, but I do hope you can come out and enjoy the season at Boyceville and come see the work. So Gabriela and I have been talking back and forth when doing these tours, and I always start with saying how exciting this project was for me, because in my work typically, which have been associated with institutions, you start with a clean slate. And this is where there was a space and a place with so much context. So when I considered the artist that would be perfect to intervene in a space such as the Held Foundation, I thought about Gabriela because her work that I followed for probably 10 years. I've known Gabriela from New York, and did earlier studio visits when I was at the curatorial program at Bard. I knew that she was very site responsive artist. I knew that architecturally she was very attuned to buildings and to places. And interestingly enough, she did big installation outdoors. So this was kind of taking her back inside. And I'll do a little plug-in too. She's doing a one-day exhibition with the Climate Museum at, in New York City on October 10th. And she'll be doing a very kind of also site responsive piece down in New York. So I'll continue by saying that she looked at this history at the Held Foundation, and I appreciate, Alyson, that you mentioned that there wasn't a mandate from Daniel or the foundation for the artist to directly respond to the legacy of Held, but Gabriela really did. So what we're looking at is an image of Sylvia Stone, who occupied the drawing studio where you'll see Gabriela's work and installation early on. So this was the former hayloft that Sylvia Stone converted into a studio and created this trapdoor that was to aid her transport of these large plexiglass panels that she used in her work. And maybe we could find that image of the trapdoor that Gabriela intervened. Yeah, that's perfect. We could go back. So here you see the studio and the room as it is now. And Gabriela began with this history of occupants of the space. So she thought through not only how the space was occupied by Held himself later in his life, but she began with one of his partners who was in the space first. So she created a piece on the floor that took out the trapdoor and had this sort of responsive, and it's so hard to talk about because it actually moves, it interacts in the space. So there's this wind current that gets swept through this space and underneath, and this fabric piece that she created, which is linen, that she stitched onto with two colors, orange and blue. And we have a detail of that, creates this kind of painting on the floor. And it also is a very sort of liminal kind of space that's created too, because it is covering an opening in the floor. And I'll mention a little more background too that Gabriela took into consideration, which wasn't just the space of the Held studio or the compound, but she really considered her own relationship to the area. And her family occupied a house nearby, and she always had this relationship to the place through the Ashokan, which feeds New York City, and that's where Gabriela grew up. And there was a real consideration of this kind of conduit of water as an element that connected her growing up in New York to the Boyceville and West Hurley area. So this was kind of a comment I felt that was so poignant to make, where she really considered this sort of kind of moving work that really considered the element. And when Alyson talked about the kind of focal materials of RVAC, Gabriela did consider and used clay, which is a material that the other artists used outdoors. And then she created something out of graphite. So if we could go to the slide of the main component in the space, which is this graphite drawing that so there's two kind of mirroring walls in the space. And this work is actually kind of an ode and a nod to Mara Held, who occupied the studio after L. Held's death. And she wanted to consider how people who occupied this space left their mark. And this is something Gabriela does in her work, where she sort of traces this kind of evolution and how time affects a place or a material or a space. And what she did is she created this forensic drawing, which is kind of a one-on-one translation of what is in the back of the wall, which is the studs and the cleats that she then taped out in the front. And so the white that you see in the negative space is actually the cleats and the studs on the other side of the wall. So she created this kind of a one-to-one translation, autobiographical drawing of what the wall is. And when she applied the graphite directly onto the wall, as you see here, and that tape was really hard to take off because it really became a drawing of itself. She's started to reveal the use and sort of the sleight of hand on that appeared and on the surface. So you could see actually fingerprints, you could see dings, you could see where the spackle was, you could see where some of the, there's even this moment where she saw a blade, a small X-Acto knife blade that she kind of traced and reveals on the front of the wall. So the drawing becomes this kind of autobiographical, forensic almost work that sort of reveals the history of the place. So this was titled Holding Patterns for Mara, and Mara Held was the person she's responding to. And then I want to go and look at that ceramic work. So another element in the room is, yes, this work is a ceramic salt-fired clay that Gabriela created is also kind of a container. And the notion of holding and the concept of holding sort of appears in the room physically, and it's sort of portrayed through materials, and these containers that are created. But there's also sort of the larger concept of holding, of history and of a legacy. So she created this piece as a mirror image to this post that was created in the room to support actually the architecture of the space, because there was a leak and there was a need for this support structure to be present. So she loved the form. I always think of it as a kind of a minimalist kind of Flavin work, and I think about the cloth almost as a sort of activating that history in some way too. So this was titled for Jean, and Jean Benson was someone who worked with Val Held for a long time and is still residing and working at the property and for the foundation. So there's kind of these figures that are present in the room in this symbolic way, and Holding Patterns is the title of the exhibition. And when Gabriela jumps in and joins us, you know, I think she would love to tell you more in terms of the process and how she handled some of the material, or how she responded and why she chose the materials she did, which was, you know, something that we gave her the reins to do. So when she joins us, please feel free to ask her questions. And maybe I'll end with the last piece.
Hey, Olga, don't forget to talk about the railing. That's such a great piece.
Yeah. So I'll end with the railing piece. So perhaps this is like the most physical manifestation of holding, and in kind of in how the work is titled, or the exhibition is titled. And this is the piece that's titled For Al. So this is the kind of moment in the room where you enter, and when you do come visit the foundation, there's this entryway that has a railing, an existing railing that Gabriela is responding to, and sort of giving you this kind of repeat moment that isn't functional. But what she's doing there is thinking through how, the application of this space by Al Held was sort of made, and he created this small stairwell to access the space. And this kind of real connection of that you make to the space by using its support. So there was this, I thought, a really wonderful gesture that happens that also isn't functional, and it isn't immediately sort of visible when you come in, but there's a nice sort of moment when you leave the room, or when you take the whole room in, you notice it. So there's a kind of this ghosting of a presence inevitably. And I'll also say, when you walk down and when you're in the space, hopefully you get to experience the larger painting studio that is still showing Al Held's work. And Gabriela got to select and respond to sort of some of the work that is at the foundation by Al Held, which is these large black and white works from the 80s. And she also looked at some drawings that I believe are from the 70s. Danielle, is that right? That have these incredible linen mats, and there were these sort of connections were made inevitably that happened, I would say, as you know, with other artists that Alyson had talked about, and how there was this concept of holding, I think, for many people that is manifested in a few works. And also just in how connectivity happened, not just to a legacy, but to among the artists who were present and are showing their work at the moment.
Daniel, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your, experience having been at the Al Held Foundation and working in these outdoor spaces and in these historical buildings, about how the works that are there now, both indoors and outdoors, are activating the space, or what is your point of view after having been there amongst Al Held's history?
Yeah, and I mean, I think Gabriela's exhibition, and even with the titling of the pieces, that's not just Al Held, but also Mara and Jean and Sylvia who are getting a nod. Really, is just a reminder of how the many hands of the different people who have been involved in the evolution of this space, really over the century or so that these buildings have been standing. The foundation has been conducting this like parallel research project where at the same time we're opening up, the physical spaces for new exhibitions of new work. We've done a lot of very detailed historical research about the history of the buildings and the grounds, and Al Held's modifications of the buildings over the years in preparation of a application to get on the National Register of Historic Places, which we finally made it this year as well. So it's like we're kind of toggling back and forth across this 100-year span, and all those choices, the very deliberate choices, which were made, many and most by Al Held, but also by others along the way, I think influenced the work in somewhat surprising ways. So looking back at the photos of the pool, it was a reminder that it was only in 2019, I think, that we actually uncovered the pool, and there was a fence that went entirely around it, but then we removed most of that fence. So we actually opened up this vista and a relationship between the upper hillside and the pool, whereas that relationship had been closed off by a fence for decades. And we had no intention on thinking that eventually some artist would come in and create a site-specific, ceramic work in response to it. And all the landscaping of those rocks. I mean, those rocks weren't there 3 years ago. We just placed them there as landscaping. So for our visitors, they may come and think that this is the way it's been for the 50 years, that Al Held, owned the place and worked there. But in fact, there have been many evolutions to it in his lifetime and then after his death. And so it's really helped us learn more about our own history and the history of art making. The outdoor sculpture show was also inspired in part by Held's relationship with Ronald Bladen, who was an important sculptor, somewhat of a minimalist, but he was a little bit more than a sort of classic or canonical minimalist, but he was in, shows like Primary Structures. So Bladen and Held were very good friends in the 50s and the 60s. And in fact, Bladen built one of his most famous sculptures on the property in 1967, this huge 22-foot tall X shape out of wood, which was then dismantled and shipped to the Corcoran, where it was on view as part of a major show there called Scale as Content, the title of which actually happened to come from a comment by Held, because he worked so big, but he didn't just work size for the sake of size, but in fact, he was really using gravity and scale as a medium in his work. So I think that sensitivity to site, to location, to materiality, which Held brought into his paintings, but also had this like three-dimensional sensory experience for him, redounds through the projects that we've been working on the last year or so. So it's very exciting, and just don't know. I'm looking forward to the future too. I mean, who knows where we'll go with it, but it's really been a great year, and especially at this time of the pandemic, to have outdoor space where small groups of people can safely gather and walk through in a guided tour, I think has really promoted intimacy and conversation, and has really been just such a great experience for all of us involved.
That's one thing I was going to bring up, listening to all of you speak today. I'm really struck by the very generous collaborative nature of these exhibitions and this partnership you've developed, and knowing that it and also this commitment to sustainability, and just knowing that all of this has been generated in the last year and a half of the pandemic. Is that something that you all were conscious of as these exhibitions were coming together, or did it play a role for you at all?
Well, the first exhibition with Laura Kaufman, which was in that same drawing studio space where Gabriela's work is now, we conceived of it prior to the pandemic was happening, but it hadn't really, hit us. It was February and March of 2020 that we were putting it together until the whole world stopped, and that those plans stopped as well. So really the whole partnership really has happened within this time. And I think we've been very sensitive to the needs of artists and the needs of our community because of, the timing of everything. So sustainability, I think, is certainly a part of it. But I think it's sustainability, beyond sort of environmental values, but also just like what's sustainable on a human level.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Alyson wants to chip in.
Alyson, did you have any thoughts on that, Alyson?
Yeah, I think when you say sustainable, I think of so many different things. And one of them also goes to, and I guess I'm in this mode because of having just founded this organization, the sustainability of the organization itself. And, to make to have the pandemic come and make it a priority to pivot the way that we were operating to something more intimate because you couldn't gather large groups of people anyway. And also to move away from the notion that we would have a permanent location and instead create these partnerships and make that our primary focus. Ended up being a good thing from the point of view of a more sustainable model for running an organization. And not having to think about fundraising for a space or a new roof or, all of the expenses that it takes to keep a place going, and instead take stock of the amazing spaces that already existed and just needed to be engaged and activated. And everything played out so perfectly in terms of this collaboration. And the foundation's willingness to open up to younger artists to use the space and to collaborate with us and allow us to have this sort of curatorial role there. But one of the things that I've also always been struck by when, working with the foundation and working in these spaces is that it's not like other artists, foundations, studios that I've been to, because it's still operating, it's still being used. The big main painting studio, Jean is still taking things out of storage and hanging different works, maybe to be photographed or in preparation for an exhibition or to create or recreate something, do restoration work. All of that is still happening in the studio. And, I was struck again by when Daniel was describing the changes that have been made to the swimming pool. This is not a static place. It is still changing even after the artist is no longer there. So yes, notions of sustainability take many, many different forms. And part of it has to do with being agile and being able to change and adapt. And some of it has to do with the more specific notions of a sustainable program through a pandemic. And then certainly the things that we're thinking about at RVAC when it comes to artist materials, artworks that are being made, and what is being used and what are the processes and what impact are those having on the environment. And artists who've chosen to live in a rural place and are, in tune with nature and wanting to have a relationship with nature and to be able to have that come into their work without changing what they're saying or who they are or what their work is about, but instead just changing the materials that they're using to do that.
And is there anything throughout this past, through making these exhibitions that really surprised any of you as you had to adapt to the way we live now? And that's for all of you.
I think one of the things is just the notion of what it means to gather people together. I really, right from the start, thought about how important it was to bring people physically together. And, I described a little bit about the workshops. So I think that's been sort of the biggest change from intent to actual realization, and understanding the impact that even a small group of people can have when they come together on each other, and how that can move out further into the world. So experiences that happen at the foundation continue to resonate beyond that space and the time that we were together.
And maybe I'll just quickly say the kind of connection or the connectivity that occurred among the organizers and the foundation, but also the artists. There was this kind of exuberant moment of, gathering together for this tour and talking about the work, and artists interfacing with one another and making the work on site. So that, I think, you know, it's a wonderful thing that happens. I think this happened in particular circumstance that was quite amazing and quite beautiful setting that I think created a sort of an intimacy or a kind of connection that we didn't all know or foresee.
Thank you, Olga. And I think, Anya, if you like, we could probably begin taking questions if there are questions for anyone on the panel right now. And then when Gabriela joins us, she can also chime in.
Yeah, that sounds good. We do have a few questions just based off of the conversation we've had so far. One moment. Our first question comes from Jean-Marc. Here you are. If you'd like to speak, I think you can unmute yourself. And I can.
There.
Oh, hi, there you are. Wonderful.
Sorry, I didn't know whether giving the question out via video was an option. So, hi everyone. Yeah, no. I think I've crossed paths with a few of the good folks speaking here today. So it's just great to have an actual sort of happy ending or happy beginning story to this whole COVID time. It's kind of it's embarrassing to be so promising and hearing such great stories. But I was curious about whether there was a few names that came through about the partnerships that you were creating with folks in Germantown. I was just wondering if you could say more about who those people are and how great that kind of reflection of the community that I know and sort of work with. I feel that to be very true, that there are a lot of people, resources available just generally kind of in a very generous way. So I was just looking for names.
So the one that I mentioned is Hart Perry, and the space is called, or the place is called Southwood, and it's in Germantown. And Daniel could probably say a little bit more about him. He's a fascinating character, and the history of the place is really amazing too. And it is something I think you'd be interested in, Jean-Marc, actually. So we can talk offline too about making that connection. But yeah, Daniel, do you want to talk about how you met Hart and that happened?
Yeah, just his space has his mother, who was an artist and art dealer named Beatrice Perry, purchased this, I think, 88-acre property right on the Hudson in Germantown in the 60s, and Hart is the beneficiary of it. And I think there's a mill on site which he uses to mill wood trees that have fallen naturally. So I got to know him because his mother actually was a dealer of the work of Grace Hartigan in the early 1960s in Washington, D.C. And my research has frequently brings me to Grace Hartigan. And anyway, I got to know Hart because he still has a number of, I'd say, masterworks by Hartigan in his collection. And he's just an interesting fellow who was a pioneer of holography and student of Meyer Shapiro when he was at Columbia. So he's sort of a great storyteller and very generous spirit. So I think I was inspired to even think of reaching out to him because of Alyson's practice with sustainable materials and her partnerships with other farms in the region, with other artists and other projects. And so I felt that there was the potential there to kind of use her model of looking for farms or local sources of materials and seeing if Hart would play ball, which he did.
And to go back to another example, one of the programs that we launched this year, River Valley Arts Collective launched this year, is something that, for lack of a better name, we're calling Money and Materials. And the idea is to give artists a grant and access to certain materials to use in their own studio over, the course of a year or so. And we then circle back with them to see what has come of it. So the first iteration of this project paired raw wool from Cabbage Hill Farm, which is one of the farms we've been working with, and from their March shearing. And so wool from that spring shearing went to 3 different artists, now have it in their studios. And we're just sort of curious. They're not artists who generally work with the material. They are going to have to do a lot of experimentation and research, but they were willing to take on the challenge and give it a try. And we selected them because of their predisposition to work with a broad range of materials, and also the understanding that they had the potential to really make something of it. But we gave the grant, both the financial and material grant, with no expectations, saying if nothing you feel comfortable showing comes out of this, then you don't have to show it. But if it does, and you have the desire to present work made from the wool, and whether it's like one little piece of the wool in a bigger project or entirely made from the wool, also wasn't a requirement at all. So that would be another example, Jean-Marc, of finding material resources. And if you follow the farming and you understand the people who are raising sheep have to be sheared every year. And the wool, there's a whole economic story behind wool that's really fascinating, but the farmers can't always get it to mills. And so there often is a lot of raw wool that doesn't get completely utilized. And so to be able to come swooping in along that chain and pull it out of the production early and put it into artist studios was really exciting.
And the artist is present.
Yes. Before we continue,
hi, everybody.
Questions. Yes, I'd
Welcome.
like to welcome Gabriela to the conversation and give you a moment, Gabriela, if you'd just like to say hello and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for letting me come in late. I'm an artist and sometimes writer and educator working in New York. And my work, as may have been evident in the slideshow, contends with the built environment, architecture, humans' interactions with built environment and architecture, and that sort of ongoing conversation, and takes a full range of materials to do that. So it's a brief intro.
When we were speaking earlier before you arrived, Gabriela, Olga mentioned that it might be interesting for the audience to hear about some of the materials that you chose for the works that are in the exhibition and your thinking and process behind them. Yeah,
I think first the wall works, I think really naturally I gravitated towards drawing materials. So thinking of graphite, not as in a pencil form, but just as its sort of raw powdered form. And what actually making a drawing of this site would be like from the site, an autobiographical drawing of the site. So letting the graphite bring that forward. And the application was a kind of a rubbing or buffing of the wall. So through that, all the marks and fingerprints and remains of use kind of came forward. And then the other piece is the ceramic piece. I was really excited by this ceramic silo that was on the grounds of the Held Foundation that back when it was a dairy farm was used to store grain. It's a form of silo making that had kind of a brief little period where the tiles were all salt fired and then assembled on site. But it's a beautiful structure. And I love that it had this resonance with holding and holding nourishment and caretaking in its own time from the site's use. And so holding patterns for Jean is this mimetic structure that are vessels, ceramic vessels that copy this other holding structure, which is this column that Jean Benson created to support the track that Al Held built outside the studio to bring his paintings through from the warehouse to the main studio. And you can see in this photo, there's a little bit of like a hole in the wall right in the corner there. And so it appears that Gene told me there'd been water damage, and so he built this column to support it after the other column had been compromised. So I love that this structure that he'd made that was part of the room was sort of this, like, it was a sculpture in a way, but it was also very much a product of a need and a product of that evolution of the space from natural forces. So, going through the space, I was looking for these moments where there were, interchange between the use of the space and the structure of the space. And then, so the fabric piece, I sort of landed on, was one of the kind of later decisions. When we opened that trapdoor that Sylvia had had created and then used to move material into and out of the space, I was just so struck by the kind of like air that came through, the kind of like, there was like a change in the space physically. I played with some ideas of moving the trapdoor, putting something else there, but in the end, thinking about this woven material that then I inserted my own threads into and let the material hold these new additions. It made sense just as a way to cover the space and kind of bring attention to it, but let it continue to be a living structural change. And then the hand railing is a paper pulp structure that's usually, I make a lot of works using hand railings and thinking about that object as this moment where we're invited to touch architecture and hold its hand. And it's also kind of communicating through its associations that we have, that there's support, that it's going to lead us through the space. So I really love playing with that form. And then I've been making these hand railings, and the paper pulp that's exposed on this one is actually usually hidden by another layer of plasticine or clay, which more closely kind of captures marks in my making, and if anyone kind of grabs it. But this, with the paper pulp, it will still capture mark because it's a matte, it's like paper, but with a little bit of plaster in it. And so I was, playing with the idea again of like a drawing studio and it being paper, and also kind of more of like the bones of one of these pieces.
Thank you, Gabriela. We had just before you arrived started taking questions, and Anya, I don't know if there were other questions for Gabriela in the chat.
I actually had a question for Gabriela that was sparked by something Olga said about the trapdoor piece. And she was speaking on that, saying, or calling it a kind of conduit, and speaking to your relationship with the area as someone from New York City, and mentioned your relationship to the Ashokan. And that struck me, and I'd love to hear you kind of speak on, if you're thinking of water and what that means for that space to be a conduit for water.
I love the use of the word conduit with water, because I think it does relate to its kind of constantly moving state and energy that for me is a really, it's part of the way infrastructure about water gets built. And I think particularly about the New York City water system. I grew up in New York City, and in the city you kind of don't necessarily think about where your water is coming from, the things that make it get there. But after I graduated from college, my parents actually bought a house in West Hurley, which is right next to the Ashokan Reservoir, and so I suddenly discovered where my water came from, and have since been really just absolutely fascinated by the system. It's over 100 miles gravity fed, and was built, when there was mostly just still horses pulling things and some steam engines. So, wonderful link there, Wikipedia, good. And so I think, for me, water as a sort of conduit between two places. I mean, in this case here, it's making this connection between New York City's growth and sustaining New York City and this other location that geographically is both near and far, and this other population, and it creates this link between the populations as well. And I felt like that trapdoor, had a bit of that. It was both a coming and a going, and it was kind of creating this link between like a underside that's unseen, maybe in a site that's more visible. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I was wondering, I mean, I'd love to hear Olga potentially either speak to the work, or wondering if you have any questions or anything you wanted to ask Gabriela while we have you two in the same Zoom.
Oh, thanks, Anya. That's that's nice. We do this in the space. Gabriela, I did plug in a little bit about your upcoming show at the Climate Museum.
Thank you.
And I also, we had some questions around sustainability and how that relates to the organization, and how the work with artists sort of looks a little bit different than creating work for commercial purposes.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly have that background too, working at an alternative space. I've known your work to be very, not only place or site responsive, but you had a direct piece directly linked to the Hurricane Maria and its effect on Puerto Rico. And I, maybe want to give you the opportunity to talk about your project with the Climate Museum, and then how that sort of evolved, or maybe from your thinking and your work.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have a project that I hope anyone who's in the New York City area will come to October 10th in Washington Square Park, and it's with the Climate Museum, which is a really exciting organization that's working to harness creativity's power to build a community that is creating climate action. And I think it's a really intelligent avenue that's underutilized. I think, as artists we have, and as creative professionals, so much ability to kind of create community and create a positive feeling towards doing something. And I think we need that. It's not all doom and gloom. There's hope in there, and I think that's like where we have a pivot point. And so the piece is made of a water-soluble paper, and I landed on that material because I wanted to find something that was vulnerable, and that was vulnerable specifically to water, just like New York City is, and so many communities. But living in New York City, having grown up here, it felt personal to make it out of something that was vulnerable to water. And over the course of the day, this sculpture that I made, which is cast from the windows of my childhood home, which I actually live in again. And so, this metaphor for a home that feels like something stable, but really maybe isn't, that has a kind of inherent sort of, again, vulnerability to the elements and to what's happening in the climate. And taking this thing that's very precious to me and giving it out to the participants that come to Washington Square Park on that day. So I'll be tearing apart the sculpture piece by piece from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And you can take a piece and cherish it, destroy it, give it to somebody else, whatever you do with it. It's this invitation to participate. It's an invitation to be part of this community that's caring about what happens next and how to make something positive happen. And there will be other events happening on, this is on Garibaldi Square in Washington Square Park. So it's I believe the east side of the park. There'll be some other calls to climate action. There'll be some interactive opportunities to work with the part of the piece that you're given. And it's going to be family fun. So I hope we can all come. And I think, the work that Olga mentioned that was at Storm King, I think I never considered myself a climate artist. And I think though now it's kind of become apparent that, at least to me, we're all climate artists. There's no way that this is not affecting each and every one of us. And whether or not the work is directly about the climate or about what's happening, there are still opportunities to let it become part of the conversation of the positive change that we need.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. I think we have another question for you from our own Nick Bennett, if you're ready.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so
Thanks.
much. Thank you all for this wonderful
Nick.
conversation. Hi, and thank you, Gabriela. I really resonate with what you just said, and I think it's so important to not see certain artists or curators or other people as kind of climate specialists, but more that it's so important for each and every one of us to kind of consider how we are a part of that. So that just that struck me. I have maybe somewhat of a simple question, but I'm curious with maybe some work that may be forthcoming or things that you're working on, if there are any particular things that you were reading or things that you were watching or things that you're engaging with that are potentially inspiring where your mind is kind of going into the future and the future of your work.
That's a great question. It also it somewhat gives me a bit of anxiety because I've been so focused on what's been happening right now that I haven't given as much thought to the future in the present as I might normally have. But I do think that there's something that's coming out of this pandemic time as well, and kind of into this. It feels more intense than normal even this fall. I think because of the contrast. Of how studio practice maintains a stability and maintains a sort of sustainability, both internally and to the external world moving forward. That's sort of like a big question that I feel like I need to kind of think about more once I'm kind of out of the woods of these two projects. And I'm excited to read, a friend of mine just recommended Overstory, which is a book that's a novel about, as far as I understand it, communication among trees, and uses that as a kind of conduit for all this other information that I also found out that Obama recommended. So maybe you all know about it already. I've been kind of in the dark recently. So, but I'm excited to read that. And yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to also just kind of like be in the world again, look around, get outside.
That's so great. I'm gonna add the Overstory to my reading list.
Oh, wonderful. Well, we can all read it. We can have a book club later.
We'll do that. Part 2.
It's been on my list.
Thank you. Thanks, Gabriela.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Gabriela. I also like that you're just taking in the world as your another source. Our next question comes from DE, and I believe this is for Alyson and Daniel, although, well, they could be answered.
No, thank you. Hi. And thank you to you and to Jessica and of course to Rail always for bringing River Valley to our attention. I didn't know about it. I'd known about the Held estate, but I didn't know it had been created to this. Kind of touched upon the question already, but maybe we could take it a little further. Given the historicity of the place, can you explain how River Valley creates cohesion between farming and art? You kind of talked about coming from the farm to the art. Is there any from the art going back into the farming at all in terms of, you know, a cohesion that cements it even more with that agricultural community?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. When we were doing, Candace and I were doing our research upstate, we found a few artist residency programs that were connected to organic farms. If they aren't exactly on the site, there's either the artists who are on the residency are also working at the farm, or certainly the farm is providing food for the residents while they're there. Denison Hill is one of them. Cheshama North is one. And then Space on Ryder Farm is actually a artist residency program that is on a farm. So there is a reciprocity and a connection, both physical and programmatically in all of those places. For River Valley Arts Collective, it's less formal. It's about connections that we've made along the way, meeting people. Cabbage Hill Farm, I know because I work at my local farmers market, and I have for the last 7 years. And I've gotten to know quite a few farmers that way. And that's how I've learned a lot about sourcing materials for artists. For example, when we did our natural dye workshop a year ago, all of the marigolds came from Cabbage Hill Farm because they grow the marigolds as an insect repellent, but they don't actually use them for anything further. So the Anne, who's the farmer there, collected them at the end of the season and dried them for us, and they're an incredible dye material. So that lent another really good example. If you are living upstate, and the artists that we're serving are, and you can learn about farming processes and who's farming, and it can be vegetable farming, but it can be other types of farming as well. There's an incredible hemp farm called Hudson Hemp that we've gotten to know a little bit. There's a dairy farm. There are wonderful dairy farms. And so when you get to know the farm and what their processes are and what they're using and what maybe ends up in compost but could be diverted and used for art making, there's a rich supply of materials. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much, G.E., and thank you, Alyson. Our penultimate question will come from Linda Stillman, and you should be able to speak, but I can also read your question out.
Hi,
Hi.
I was lucky enough to go to the dyeing workshop a year ago. It was really a fantastic experience. And I wonder if you have any other workshops coming up in the future.
Yes, so since then we did a weaving workshop at Atlas Studios. We did the basket making workshop last October at the Held Foundation, which we saw a picture of yesterday. I can't believe it was only yesterday, but it was. We did a felt making workshop at the Archipenko Foundation. And then the natural dye workshop was certainly one of the most popular and that we got asked about a lot. So we're doing that one again, but with a different instructor. This time we're working with Brees Honeycutt, and Brees will be leading that workshop, and that's on October 11th at the Held Foundation. But if artists who are listening now, or if you know of others, have particular workshops that relate to sourcing and using fiber, wood, and clay, I would love to hear your ideas. And if you work with those materials and want to do a skill sharing workshop, that's what I love to see, is artists having these opportunities to share their skills with their peers. So I'm very open to other ideas. I certainly want to do one around green woodworking and carving, using hand tools. So I have a few potential instructors for that, and then the combination then is to find locations for the workshops as well. So we're always partnering with different organizations to find great locations, inspiring locations to do the work.
Thank you, Linda, for that great question. And thanks, Alyson. Yes, stay updated with River Valley Arts Collective. I'll put the link to their site in the chat shortly. And our final question will come from our publisher and artistic director, Fong Bui. Hi, Fong.
Hola. Thank you, Anya.
Hi, Fong.
Thank you, Alyson. Thank you, Jazz. Thank you, Olga. And who else here? Daniel! Yes! Our Held Foundation. Al and I used to argue, about politics from sometimes would last 2 or 3 hours. And he loved the rail, and we are grateful to Al and of course Mara and Daniel and the foundation for having support the Held Critical Essay, where we commission people to write critically about, visual culture, many of whom are now very well known. And that's been an amazing, stable, standardized form of writing for the rail that inspire younger people to do the same, so to speak. But anyway, so we're grateful to the Held Foundation, grateful to you guys. And Alyson, we know each other a long time. Gabrielle, in fact, was my former graduate student at RISD. I always thought about her as a tectonic poet in a way. in response to sight and through material. And you were that way too, way from your first year in graduate at RISD. But it's just terrific that you all managed to come through and respond to this temporary autonomous zone, which is what Hakim Bey's famous book 1991 is about, how to activate the space that hasn't been structured, institutionalized, and whatever, bureaucratized even worse. So it's great that you managed to move through, and I'm so thrilled and happy that, you know, the foundation managed to open up that space for you guys, and how courageous of you to have done this too, Alyson, Olga, and Gabriela. I don't, forgive me if I don't mention to everybody's name, but this is exactly what the Rail has been doing. So we have kindred spirit. It's gotten strength, it's strengthened our collective thinking. And this is what it's about, it's coming together and work together, not separate like we have been for so long. So this is probably the most profound thing that happened during this pandemic, is that we realize our democracy is so fragile, and social distancing to disaster. So this is social, intimate, being close together. And that's how we will be doing super soon from now on. So thank you. I'm grateful. I'm very inspired. The Rail, as you guys know, is created to elevate the artist's voice. So today, just to show you, the issue will be tied together with the October issue is Don the Judge, 26,000 something words ranting against Carl Panza. It's marvelous. I might get put back on the boat. Thank you, you guys. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Alyson, Jen, and Olga. And let's get together soon, okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we can go back to see the sculpture site specifically as well as Visions of Foundation. So thank you, you guys. Much love and courage. Back to you.
Thank you, Fong. Thanks, Fong, so much for those words. And thank you, all of you, Daniel, Alyson, Jess, Olga, and Gabriela. Thank you for coming. This has been a really wonderful conversation. And at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending all of our new social environments and common ground and community events with a poetry reading. And today, I have the pleasure of being both the MC and the reader. I'll be reading from our poetry editor, Anselm Berrigan's new book of poems, Pregrets. Pregrets recently came out with Black Square Editions, and this week we've been paying tribute to the work, closing out each event with a reading from his text. And tomorrow we'll have the privilege of hearing Anselm himself read to close out our event, so make sure to tune in for that. And now I'll be reading Pregrets. Many of the works are share the same title. So this is Pregrets from Pregrets. Upside down self-portrait by elder daughter sees through the scaffolding of his and his conceptions, speaking as a haphazard encounter of a few lines, a few colors, a few shells, a few insects, a few detours, a few toxins, a few lies, a few fade patterns, one definite assertion. The accidental order for the lost instinct has to take the shake of its measure. Feeds full of burnt kids, everyday glow cut out, inert, key lime irritant, foxy beads, the essence of the shit so rich in isolation, elusive even to irrationality. Happy socks pictured in plastic studios, setting up the deep steel again and again on film in the boards. Under the little flash, the little pileated shop-worn mask. Someone just walked in and took their time's photograph. I don't wonder about the miniature objects lining up in me, not so secretly, all illusions currently in the shop, which is all air. For instance, we're writing in sentences. Nothing has to be having matter. Want to say a few words about lino engraving, refuse to ensure the backup tribe, the stand-ins, a gang of vicious holograms in defiance of their own needs, and so forth. Matisse was ambivalent about words, Word said. Thank you. That was Anselm Berrigan, and you can look in the chat to see his work and see a video of Anselm himself reading. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Again, thank you, Alyson, Daniel, Olga, Gabriela, and Jess, and all who tuned in and asked amazing questions and put their ponderings in the chat. As always, we'll share the recordings of today's program in our YouTube archive, so keep an eye out for that in the next few days. That'll be up on the Rail event page. And you can join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation on Bruce Conner and Jay DeFeo, featuring esteemed curators Rachel Fetterman, Laura Huckman, Stuart Comer, with Rail Editor-at-Large Constance Llewellyn. And we'll conclude, of course, with a reading from our Rail poetry editor, Anselm Berrigan. And you should now be able to turn on your microphones and say goodbye. Thank you all.
Thanks, Anya. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Jess.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Olga. Thanks,
Bye.
Gabriela.
Everyone make their way to the Held Foundation by October 10th.
Yes.